6th of August 2024, vintage machinery. Now folks, it's the month of August, and in normal societies, the month of August is meant to be a time for reflection and a bit of fun. And I do not want my channel to be always giving out. I want to be something there for people to enjoy. We have various shows coming up, and we have the steam threshing in Minority, and you'll have one in Abbey Leaks, and they're very well attended events. So it is an interesting thing to see how we got to where we are from the point of view of agriculture. Now remember, there was one time you had to have two people pulling some kind of a bucksheat plough, and I'm told, according to Wikipedia, the first proper plough was invented by John Deere in 1837. There's certainly old ploughs around here. I don't know how long they go back with, and they were pulled with two horses. That was essentially that. The tractors then came on the scene, and the first was the steam tractor. And I must say I have a great interest in them. There's a lovely smell of them, and there's a lovely rhythm to them. For threshing corn with a drum, with a threshing mill, I think the steam tractor is the most natural thing, and it is the simplest and the most effective way of driving that drum, because it has a and it works, and it's governed and everything. Absolutely beautiful. But they weren't practical for many things. Yes, there was ploughs with them. There used to be two each side of a field, in a big field, and you'd pull it over and back with a rope, the plough. But really, it wasn't until the Fordson tractor came up that they started having something of a modern tractor. Now, it must be remembered, the early fuel for tractors was coal. Then it became petrol, volatile petrol. That's what we call gasoline. And then it became another part of oil, which is tractor vaporizing oil. Now, that always was said to be different from paraffin. And I distinctly remember buying paraffin and TVO, tractor vaporizing oil. And there were two separate products. And I knew the smell of a TVO tractor a mile away. They had the most beautiful smell. And you can make TVO with paraffin and some petrol. But what you're doing is you're adding to the volatility, the evaporation characteristics a bit, but it's not the same as the TVO. And there is a fuel that is still in use, and that's the jet engine, the aviation fuel. Every time I step off a flight, that I fly somewhere and get off the plane, as I step down, particularly if you step out the back, I always go out the back, you can smell the engine, and that fuel is the very same fuel that we were using in our tractor way back years ago. Okay, of course the TVO tractor starts on gasoline or petrol, and when it gets warmed up, the exhaust gases are passed past a plate, and that heats the TVO coming in, and then it'll run on the TVO proper. Now, there's another form of engine that was in the Lands tractor, which is a hot bulb engine, and I did a video on that, and they don't have a plug at all, or they have a kind of an injector, but not like the modern injector. It just sprays in the fuel on a hot bulb, and that explodes and keeps it running. They're nearly all two strokes, right? We'll not go into that, but so as the horse went out, and I remember ploughing with horses. I didn't do it myself. I remember walking as a wee fella after people ploughing with horses. And I knew a fella over in the west of County Cavan, and he had a Ford Dexter and a trailer, and he put the horses on the plough into the trailer, like a big cattle trailer, and he drove with his tractor to the field, and he then ploughed. And I said to him, "Oh, why don't you actually put a plough on the tractor?" He wasn't too happy with that question. Not a good one. Maybe it was the land was wet to get into it, but in West Cavan they used to put the potatoes in the centre of a field and fence it off. I'm only telling you, I saw that. So the first tractor that I saw on the job was the Fordson, and it did not have a hydraulic on it. It usually used for hauling loads and for threshing. They were great for threshing. They had a side pulley and all of that. Now, as they were coming on, the Lands was starting up as well, and the Lands was a competitor to it. And in England, Ferguson tied up with David Brown, and the David Brown tractor were mainly English. But in America, Ferguson tied up with Henry Ford, but Henry got old and his grandson took over, and they had a few tractors that are of interest, and which are the ones I know. There's no point me going anywhere talking unless I know what I'm talking about. Now it must be remembered, this video is for fun and a bit of crack, and to learn from it. I don't know all about them, but I can tell you I cut hay for hours and hours with a Ferguson, a Ford Ferguson. There was big trouble over what was what. And there was the Ford 9N, and there was the Ford 2N, and there was the Ford 8N. And the strange thing about them is the numbers didn't run logically. They didn't have a Ford 2 and a Ford 3 and a Ford 4. They had a Ford, I think it was 9 was the first. And then they had the 2. That's one, we had a 2. But we also had the what do you call them? The Ford Nan. Now, I'll tell you a few things about them which I can be certain about. Now, some of those Ford Nans were adopted and fitted with a Perkins 3-cylinder engine, which were also in the Massey Ferguson. And that meant you effectively had a diesel Ford Nan. Now, the word Nan, N-A-N, is on the internet and is still available, but I understand that they've used the word N. So the first genius to come up with what the N meant, we'll give him a thumbs up. I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find out what the N was, but I think a lot of people just call them Nan. So a 9N was a Ford Nan, and some people said the Ford Nan was different. But there was a difference in the paint. Some of these tractors were red underneath. They had the grey bonnet and they were red underneath. And some of them were all grey. And some of the wheels on the back of them had a bulge out. So the wheel was bulging out a bit. The hub was out, that it would be level with the outside of the tyre. Whereas others were like a modern tractor, the hub was in a bit. The other thing is, some had a 3-speed gearbox. The one we had, I believe, is a 2N, and it had a 3-speed gearbox, forward and one reverse. Then later ones had a 4-speed gearbox and one reverse. The exhaust pipe of the ones we had was always running underneath, except when they were converted to Perkins, in which case the exhaust pipe went up in the air. But our one had the exhaust pipe underneath, and when you'd be fitting things to it, they'd be popping out in your face there. All of them had 3-point linkage, and all of them had hydraulics, and the arms of the 3-point linkage was fitted underneath the axle, which meant that when the pull came on it, it tended to push the wheels down and lift the back wheels up. So if it was overstretched, the plough, for example, ploughing, tended to lift up the back wheels and you got it spinning. A lot of people thought, oh, they're spinning. That was designed into it. That if you hit a rock, the tractor, you see my hands there, it'd be going along like this, and the tractor would be lifted. See, the back wheels. And that's still how 3-point linkage works. They also had stabilizing arms and all that. Now, another thing about them, as we look about them, the one we had 2 batteries each side, in front of the axle. And they had a spike out like this for your foot. And some of the Masseys had that. Well, then some of the later ones had a flat floor panel that you could put your boot down on. So I'll be checking out some of them. I know where there are some of them, and I'm going to be giving a bit more on them like that and be able to give certainty, because I'll be looking at the tractor themselves. Now, I think the Ford 2N had 2 batteries each side, but they were hooked in parallel. She was a 6-volt. And that's a huge problem getting them. It's very hard to get a 6-volt battery now. I don't know where any of them 12-volt. And they all had a patent number on front of the steering. And I think all the ones we had were made in Britain. Was it Dagenham or somewhere? I must look. And can get the patent numbers are still on them. They were big about their patents. And the other ones were made in Dearborn in Michigan in America, where Henry Ford was based. So they sold them in America, and they sold them in Britain and Ireland, and they were extremely popular. At the same time that David Brown was coming out, and the Farmer was coming out, International Harvester was on the go. They were coming out there. Now, the other thing, of course, the Lands was coming out, and they were common enough around this time. They were a noisy yoke and difficult to start and all that, depending on what model you have, of course. They didn't have a hydraulic. I don't know, had any of them hydraulic. Maybe someone will be able to say they had a hydraulic in later years. Okay, and had they a power takeoff? I don't believe they had. You see, in the earlier tractors, there was no power takeoff. There was a pulley on the side, driven at right angles, and that's what drove any machinery via a belt. With these type of modern style tractors, they had a power takeoff, but the shaft of the Ford the Ford ends, was a smaller shaft. You had to get an adapter to put on it, and they would break. The modern power takeoff is a later thing, and that modern power takeoff was in the Massey 35Xs. They had the heavier power takeoff, but the Ford ends did not have that. The Ford ends did not have a side pulley either. You couldn't put a side pulley on them, but you could on the Fordson. That's the blue Fordson, not the TVO Fordson. The TVO Fordson, of course, had a side pulley, but the Fordson, the blue Fordson, also had a side pulley, and they were a fantastic tractor in many ways. I never had one, but people had them, but I know that they incorporated all of this. Now you can correct me on any of this if you think I'm wrong. Now, in the case of the TVO Fordson, the old Fordson, the one with the driver sitting out behind, they had a 3 speed and a 4 speed. I know a person had a 3 speed, and the seat would be out behind, and there was the clutch. Now, they had no crown wheel like you have nowadays in where the differential is. They had a big bronze crown wheel with a worm gear. There was a worm gear, so you had the drive shaft going like this down underneath, and then you had the I have nothing here. I think that'll do this. So that's where the pause function comes in on the phone, on the camera. You can't get a camera with that on it, only a mobile phone. We'll say this clay pigeon is the crown wheel, and it went like this. It was a worm gear. I've made them on the lathe, actually, for other purposes. And so that was it. And there was a worm gear on this here, like a tread. Now, the problem with them was you couldn't tow it. You could not move that tractor by pulling it. This shaft would not go round. If it did, you'd have a terrible growl out of it, and you could do lots of damage. So the whole pressure, as this was going round, it was pushing this round, and you'd hear grinding when they'd be moving it at low speed under pressure. But it worked pretty good. I mean, it just shows you the strength. If maybe brass was in it, the wheels were taken out of them and sold. They were for scrap metal in that way. So now you get the idea of that worm wheel. That meant you couldn't tow it, and it also meant you couldn't start it with a push, or you couldn't park it on a hill and let it down the hill. It simply wouldn't go, because this was effectively a brake. That's the nature of worm gears. So the other thing about the Fordson was the earlier ones had a magneto, not a battery, a magneto. Now, I know sons of people who had them, now my age, and they'd say they were no bother at all. Well, number one, you had to go out, you had to get her primed, you had to get it ready, and you had to twist the handle to get her moving, and if you were lucky, she could go. Pop, 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 pop. But you wouldn't be lucky every day. And so when you'd be swinging it, you had to get enough speed up to make the magneto trip. The magneto had a little thing in it that would retard it a bit and then let it go suddenly. It was very inefficient when you were doing it by hand. You had to twist the whole engine, the compression, and the bit going into the gearbox and the clutch mechanism. You'd have it out of gear, of course, but there was still a bit at the back. So you were twisting an awful lot of machinery. And my father always said, anyone that ever had them died of a heart attack. And they'd put a button over the plug to give the spark a little bit more strength. And if you hadn't that, you could get her very, very hard to start. They had a flap that you pull down that to keep it hot, keep the water hot and heat it up quicker. So other people say, no, not at all, you twisted it. There's no joke twisting a Fordson, I can tell you. No joke. Now, the other thing is that then brought in the battery with a coil and a pints and a condenser. and all of that. And that was a different story. That was easy done. Once the battery had power in it, she'd start easier. So you didn't have the extra work of twisting the magneto, and you didn't have the extra complication of twisting the magneto. So they were slightly better. I know a man bought one of them as a novelty. I went with him to buy it years ago, and he bought the tractor. It was a 3-speed, a lovely tractor, and he brought it home, and he'd bring it to Vintage, and he used to ask them up a minority if he could put his tractor in to give it a go, and they'd let him and all of that. But when he had it first, he was twisting it one day, and it backfired, and when it backfired with the starting handle, it brought the handle round. So when you're twisting this way, if the engine starts, it just pushes the handle out. It's a ratchet. But if it goes the other way, it'll bring the handle around. And it broke his leg, between his leg and his ankle, and he was hospitalized and in a plaster for weeks. That's the reality of those tractors. So the wow start, the electric start, was a great advantage. Okay. Now the one we had, the 2N, you could start it with the lever. The gear lever was the starter. There was another one you had to push a button on the side, and then the gear lever was the starter. I think ours didn't have a button. That was a safety, so that when you be using it, you wouldn't accidentally be starting the engine and damage the Bendix. So that's that bit for now. That's a good video. Please don't look at it unless you're interested, and we'll get a bit more going on this subject about vintage machinery, because it is August. It is the time for the steam threshings and all of that, and it's nice to have a chat about it. It's not politics, not anything else. We'll see you back for something else, folks. Good luck. Thank you.